rain came down in sheets that October night in 1943, turning the streets of Portsmouth into rivers of reflected light. Inside the Anchor and Crown, a converted warehouse that served as an Allied recreation hall, the music was loud enough to drown out the storm. A jazz band assembled from various American units played hot swing numbers that had soldiers from 3 different armies crowding the dance floor. The air tasted like smoke and sweat and the cheap cologne that soldiers splashed on before heading into town. Nobody was thinking about the war. For a few hours, they could pretend they were somewhere else, someone else, anyone but young men preparing to die. Corporal William Davies stood near the bar, nursing a warm beer, and watching his fellow Canadians teach some American boys how to properly execute a jitterbug. Davies was 24 years old, though his eyes looked older. He had joined the Royal Regiment of Canada straight out of Toronto in 1939, back when everyone thought the war would be over by Christmas. 4 years later, he knew better. He had seen France fall, survived Dieppe, and watched too many friends die screaming in places whose names he could barely pronounce. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Drinks, music, maybe a few laughs. Nothing complicated. The Americans at the table next to him were telling stories about basic training, their voices overlapping in that eager way young soldiers have when they're still excited about the uniform. 3 of them were white boys from somewhere in the Midwest, their accents flat and earnest. 2 were black men from different units, one from Chicago and another from Alabama. They had met earlier that evening and discovered they all shared a love of baseball. Now they were arguing good-naturedly about whether the Yankees or the Cardinals had the better infield. The conversation flowed easy and natural, the way it does when people forget to remember what divides them. Davies liked watching moments like this. The war had a way of stripping away the nonsense. When shells were falling and men were dying, nobody cared about the color of the hand pulling you out of the mud. He had seen that reality play out 100 times, but he also knew that reality had limits. It existed in trenches and on battlefields, but somehow it never quite made it back to the recreation halls and pubs where officers enforced rules that had nothing to do with winning wars. The door banged open hard enough to rattle the hinges. 4 American military policemen pushed inside, water streaming off their ponchos. They stood in the entrance for a moment, scanning the crowd with the practiced efficiency of men looking for trouble. Davies felt his stomach tighten. He had seen this play out before in other towns, other halls. The MPs were white-helmeted and stone-faced, and they carried themselves with the aggressive confidence of men who knew they had authority and intended to use it. The lead MP was a sergeant with a jaw like a shovel and eyes that moved across the room with cold calculation. He spotted what he was looking for almost immediately. His gaze locked onto the mixed group of Americans at the table near Davies, and his mouth set in a hard line. He started moving through the crowd, his 3 companions falling into formation behind him. Soldiers stepped aside instinctively, creating a path. The music kept playing, but conversations began to die as people noticed the MPs cutting through the hall with purpose. The sergeant stopped at the table where the Americans sat. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "You two," he said, pointing at the black soldiers. "Outside, now." His voice was flat and final, the tone of someone who expects immediate obedience. The music chose that moment to end, and his words carried across the sudden silence. Heads turned, conversations stopped completely. The jazz band, sensing something wrong, did not start another song. The soldier from Chicago looked up, confused. His name was Private Jerome Washington, though Davies would not learn that until later. Washington set down his beer carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might make things worse. "Sir, we have passes," he said quietly. "We are allowed to be here." His voice was respectful but firm, the voice of someone who has learned to navigate dangerous moments with careful words. The sergeant's face did not change. "I do not care what passes you have," he said. "You are not supposed to be here. You are not supposed to be sitting with white soldiers. You know the regulations. Now move, or I will move you myself." His hand rested on the baton at his belt, a casual threat that everyone in the room understood perfectly. This was the moment that could have gone a dozen different ways. Washington could have stood up and left, avoiding confrontation the way he had been forced to avoid confrontation his entire life. The white American soldiers at the table could have looked away, pretending they did not see what was happening. The Canadians scattered throughout the hall could have decided this was not their problem, not their army, not their fight, but something else happened instead. Private Thomas Baudouin stood up. He was a slight man from Montreal, barely 5 feet 8 inches tall, with wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like an accountant than a soldier. He had been sitting 2 tables over with other men from his regiment, the Fusilier Mont Royal. He walked over to the Americans' table and placed himself between Washington and the sergeant. "Excuse me," he said in heavily accented English. There is problem. The sergeant's eyes narrowed. This does not concern you, soldier. Step aside. But Baudouin did not step aside. He stood there, hands at his sides, looking up at the much larger American through his rain-spotted glasses. I think it concerned me, he said. This is Allied facility. These men are soldiers. They have done nothing wrong. Why you want them to leave? Because they are violating regulations, the sergeant snapped. Regulations that are none of your damn business. Now get out of my way before I arrest you too. His voice had risen, and more heads were turning. The entire recreation hall was watching now, the air thick with tension. The jazz band sat frozen on their makeshift stage, instruments silent in their hands. Baudouin shook his head slowly. I do not think so, he said. I think you are the one who should leave. These men are my guests. The sergeant's face flushed dark red. Your guests? He repeated incredulously. Who the hell do you think you are? This is an American matter. These are American soldiers violating American regulations. You have no authority here. And you have no authority to remove anyone from Canadian facility, Baudouin replied. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, but there was steel underneath. This hall is run by Canadian forces. You are guest here, same as everyone, and guests do not tell other guests to leave. Davies found himself standing without quite remembering the decision to stand. Around him, other Canadians were rising too. It happened in waves, men getting to their feet in a rippling motion that spread across the hall. Within 30 seconds, perhaps 40 Canadian soldiers were standing, their attention focused on the 4 American MPs. Nobody said anything. Nobody made threats. They just stood there, a silent wall of bodies and stares. The sergeant looked around, his hand still on his baton. You are making a serious mistake, he said, but some of the certainty had leaked from his voice. He was trying to calculate odds, trying to figure out if he could push this without it exploding into something bigger. All of you are making a serious mistake. This will be reported. There will be consequences. Then report it, said a voice from near the door. Everyone turned. A Canadian lieutenant had entered during the confrontation, water dripping from his cap. His name was James Morrison, and he was the duty officer for the Canadian forces in Portsmouth that night. He was 32 years old, a veteran of the fighting in Sicily, and he looked tired in the way that combat officers always look tired, but his eyes were sharp as he took in the scene. Lieutenant, the American sergeant said, some of the aggression returning to his voice, I am glad you are here. Your men are interfering with military police operations. I need you to order them to stand down so we can remove these soldiers who are violating segregation protocols. Morrison walked slowly through the hall, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He stopped next to Baudouin, glanced at the mixed group of Americans still sitting at their table, then looked back at the sergeant. What exactly are they violating? He asked. His tone was conversational, almost curious. They are fraternizing across racial lines, the sergeant said. U.S. Army regulations clearly state that colored troops and white troops are to be kept separate in recreational facilities. These two, he gestured at Washington and his companion, are not authorized to be in establishments frequented by white personnel. Morrison nodded slowly, as if considering this carefully. I see, he said. And where exactly in U.S. Army regulations does it say that those rules apply in Canadian-controlled facilities on British soil? The sergeant's mouth opened, then closed. That's not the point, he said finally. The point is that American soldiers are expected to follow American regulations regardless of location. It is a matter of discipline and good order. No, Morrison said, his voice hardening. The point is that you have no jurisdiction here. This facility is operated by Canadian forces for the use of Allied personnel. All Allied personnel. We do not practice segregation in the Canadian military. We will not enforce it in our facilities. If you do not like that, you are welcome to leave. But these soldiers, all of these soldiers, stay. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to quiet, as if the storm itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The American sergeant's face worked through several expressions, rage and frustration and calculation, all flickering across his features. His hand tightened on his baton until his knuckles went white. Lieutenant Morrison, he said slowly, you are interfering with the internal discipline of United States forces. This is going to create serious problems between our commands. I strongly urge you to reconsider. Morrison shook his head. There's nothing to reconsider, he said. You came into a Canadian facility and attempted to remove soldiers who were doing nothing wrong. You are the one creating problems. Now you can either leave peacefully, or I can have my men escort you out. Your choice. For a long moment, nobody moved. The Americans stood rigid, clearly unused to being challenged this way. The Canadians remained standing, a quiet show of force that required no words. Washington and his friend sat frozen at their table, caught between hope and disbelief. Then, slowly, the sergeant stepped back. His jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. "This is not over," he said. "You will hear about this. Count on it." "I'm sure we will," Morrison replied calmly. "The door is behind you." The four MPs turned and walked out, their boots heavy on the floor. The door slammed shut behind them, and the sound seemed to break a spell. The tension in the room collapsed all at once, replaced by a surge of noise and movement. Canadians clapped Baudouin on the back. The jazz band, sensing the moment, launched into a triumphant rendition of "Flying Home." Soldiers rushed to the bar calling for drinks. Washington stood slowly, looking at Morrison with an expression that mixed gratitude and confusion. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I do not know what to say. You did not have to do that." Morrison shrugged. "Yes, I did," he said, simply. "You are a soldier. You have every right to be here. That's the end of it." He turned to address the room, raising his voice to be heard over the music. "Let me be clear to everyone here. This facility is open to all Allied personnel. I do not care what army you are from, what rank you hold, or what you look like. If you are here to have a drink and relax, you are welcome. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me personally." The Canadians cheered. Some of the white American soldiers looked uncomfortable, but many others were nodding in agreement. A few came over to shake Washington's hand, telling him they were glad he stayed. The soldier from Alabama, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, put his head in his hands and started crying quietly. Baudouin sat down next to him and patted his shoulder awkwardly, not knowing what to say, but understanding that words were not really necessary. Davies watched all of this unfold with a strange feeling in his chest. Pride, maybe, mixed with sadness. Pride that his fellow Canadians had stood up for what was right. Sadness that standing up for what was right was even necessary in the first place. These were men fighting the same war against the same enemy. They wore different uniforms, but they bled the same blood. The fact that some of them were treated as less than human because of their skin color struck him as obscene, a perversion of everything they were supposedly fighting for. The night continued, but it was different now. The Americans and Canadians mixed more freely, conversations flowing across tables and groups. Washington found himself surrounded by Canadian soldiers asking him about his experiences, treating him with a respect and interest he rarely encountered from white soldiers. The white Americans who had been sitting with him before seemed relieved that they did not have to pretend anymore, that they could be friends with who they wanted without looking over their shoulders for MPs. But Davies knew this was just one night in one facility. He knew that when Washington left this hall and went back to his base, he would return to a world of segregation and discrimination. He knew that the American MPs would report what happened and there would be repercussions. He knew that standing up felt good in the moment, but it did not solve the larger problem. Still, he thought, it was something. It was better than doing nothing. What Davies did not know yet was how right he was about repercussions or how quickly they would come. Within 48 hours, a formal complaint landed on the desk of Major General Charles Foulkes, the senior Canadian officer in the Portsmouth area. The complaint came from the American Provost Marshal and was blunt in its accusations. Canadian forces were interfering with U.S. military police operations. Canadian officers were undermining American discipline. Canadian facilities were encouraging violation of U.S. Army regulations regarding racial separation. The complaint demanded immediate action, including disciplinary measures against Lieutenant Morrison and Private Baudouin, and a formal agreement that Canadian forces would respect and enforce American segregation policies in their facilities. Foulkes read the complaint twice, his expression growing darker with each reading. He was a career officer, a man who understood military protocols and the importance of Allied cooperation. He also understood politics and knew that Canada's relationship with the United States was complex and delicate. The Americans were the dominant partner in the alliance, providing the bulk of resources and manpower for the war effort. Keeping them happy was important. But as he read the complaint a third time, something else occurred to him. The Americans were asking him to order his soldiers to enforce racism. They were asking Canada to adopt American policies that contradicted Canadian values. They were asking him to punish men for doing what any decent human being should do. He called a meeting with his senior staff. Around the conference table sat 6 officers, ranging from captains to colonels. Foulkes laid out the situation plainly. The Americans want us to enforce their segregation policies, he said. They want us to keep black soldiers separate from white soldiers in our facilities. They want us to help their MPs remove colored troops from areas designated for whites. They want us to discipline our men for refusing to cooperate with this. Thoughts? The room was silent for a moment. Then Colonel Andrew McLeod, the senior logistics officer, spoke up. Sir, with respect, that is absolutely unacceptable. We do not practice segregation in the Canadian military. We have never practiced it. Asking us to enforce American policies in our own facilities is asking us to abandon our principles. I strongly recommend we decline. But we need to consider the broader alliance, countered Major Harold Pierce, the liaison officer with American forces. The Americans are sensitive about this. They see it as a matter of military discipline and internal regulations. If we refuse to cooperate, it could create significant friction. We rely on American support for supplies, logistics, air cover. We cannot afford to antagonize them over what is essentially an internal American issue. It stopped being an internal American issue the moment their MPs stormed into our facility and tried to drag out soldiers who were behaving themselves, McLeod shot back. This is about our sovereignty and our values. If we roll over on this, what message does that send? That Canada has no principles? That we will abandon what is right to avoid upsetting the Americans? The debate went back and forth for an hour. Some officers argued for compromise, suggesting they could quietly discourage mixed groups without formally enforcing segregation. Others argued for taking a strong stand, insisting that Canadian values were non-negotiable. Fallux listened to all of it, his face unreadable. Finally, he raised a hand for silence. Gentlemen, he said, I appreciate all perspectives. But let me be clear about something. The Canadian military does not practice racial segregation. That is not just policy, it is a reflection of who we are as a nation. We have black soldiers serving in our ranks. We have indigenous soldiers. We have soldiers from every background imaginable. They serve together, fight together, and die together. I will not order my men to enforce discrimination that we ourselves reject. He paused, looking around the table. At the same time, I understand we must maintain the alliance, so here is what we are going to do. We will respond to the American complaint formally and diplomatically. We will state clearly that Canadian facilities operate under Canadian regulations. We will make no apology for refusing to enforce segregation. We will not discipline Lieutenant Morrison or Private Baudouin, and we will quietly pass word to all Canadian commanders that they are to maintain this position. Our facilities remain open to all Allied personnel without discrimination. Anyone who does not like that is free to use different facilities. But sir, Pierce protested, the Americans will not accept that. Falkes smiled grimly. Then they will have to learn to live with disappointment, he said. Draft the response, make it polite but firm, and make sure every Canadian commander in England gets word of this policy. I want no confusion about where we stand. The response went out the next day. It was 2 pages of carefully worded diplomatic language, but the message was clear. Canada would not enforce American segregation policies in Canadian-controlled spaces. The American Provost Marshal read it, turned purple with rage, and immediately escalated the issue to higher command. Within a week, the complaint had reached General Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters. Eisenhower was in a difficult position as Supreme Allied commander. He needed cooperation between American, British, and Canadian forces. He could not afford major friction over what many of his officers considered a minor issue. At the same time, the U.S. Army's segregation policies were not negotiable as far as Washington was concerned. Pressure from Southern congressmen and military leaders meant that integration was politically impossible. Eisenhower tried to find a middle path. He sent a carefully worded message to Canadian command, suggesting that perhaps mixed-use facilities could be avoided by having designated nights or sections for different groups. It was a compromise, he thought, that would satisfy everyone. The Canadian response was polite but unmoved. Canadian facilities would remain open to all Allied personnel at all times without restriction. Period. Eisenhower sighed and decided to let the matter drop. He had bigger problems to worry about, like planning the invasion of France. If the Canadians wanted to be stubborn about this, he would work around it. He quietly passed word to American commanders to establish their own recreation facilities where they could enforce their own rules. The Canadians could do what they wanted in their spaces. But word of the Canadian position spread rapidly through the ranks, especially among black American soldiers. They learned quickly which towns had Canadian facilities. They learned which recreation halls welcomed everyone. They learned where they could go to escape, even briefly, the constant humiliation of segregation. On weekend passes, black soldiers began traveling to areas with Canadian presence. Some would journey 20 or 30 miles out of their way just to reach a town where they knew Canadians were stationed. The Maple Leaf Club in Portsmouth, the facility where the original confrontation had occurred, became famous among Black American troops. Every weekend, hundreds of soldiers would pour through its doors, drawn by the promise of being treated like human beings. The Canadian soldiers who ran the club found themselves hosting an increasingly mixed crowd. They adapted easily, seeing no reason why the color of a man's skin should matter when deciding who could have a drink. In Aldershot, Canadian military police began quietly positioning themselves outside Canadian facilities on busy nights. Their job was not to keep anyone out, but to keep American MPs from getting in. When white-helmeted American police would show up looking to remove black soldiers, they would find Canadian MPs blocking the doors. The conversations were always polite but firm. This is a Canadian facility operating under Canadian regulations. You have no jurisdiction here. The American MPs would protest, argue, threaten reports to higher command. The Canadian MPs would shrug and remain in place. Eventually, the American MPs would leave, frustrated but unable to do anything about it. This pattern repeated itself across southern England wherever Canadian and American forces were stationed in proximity. Canadian zones became safe havens, islands of equality in a sea of segregation. The impact on Black American soldiers was profound. For many of them, it was the first time in their lives they had been treated as equals by white people. Private Jerome Washington, the soldier from the original Portsmouth incident, later wrote in a letter to his family that sitting in that Canadian facility had changed him. He described feeling, for the first time, like a real soldier instead of a second-class citizen in uniform. He wrote about Canadian soldiers who talked to him like a friend, who asked his opinion on things, who treated him with casual respect that he had never experienced from white Americans. It made him realize, he wrote, that the degradation he had endured his entire life was not natural or inevitable. It was a choice that white Americans made, and if Canadians could choose differently, maybe someday Americans could too. Washington was not alone in this realization. Thousands of black soldiers had similar experiences in Canadian facilities. They saw white soldiers treating them as equals. They saw officers defending their right to be there. They saw military police protecting them instead of harassing them. These experiences planted seeds that would grow in the years after the war, contributing to the civil rights movement that would eventually force America to confront its racial sins. But the Canadian position also created unexpected bonds that proved valuable in combat. As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, Canadian and American units trained together extensively. Black American support battalions often worked alongside Canadian combat units. The relationships built in Portsmouth recreation halls and Aldershot pubs translated into trust on the battlefield. When the invasion came in June of 1944, this trust proved its worth. During the fighting in Normandy, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division found itself dependent on supplies moved by the predominantly Black American trucking battalions. These convoys had to run through territory still contested by German forces, facing constant threat of ambush and artillery. The black drivers knew the Canadian units needed those supplies desperately. They also remembered how Canadian soldiers had treated them back in England. They drove through conditions that white American units sometimes refused, taking risks that went beyond the call of duty. When asked why they would volunteer for such dangerous runs, one driver replied simply that the Canadians had stood up for them when nobody else would. Now they were returning the favor. Similarly, when Canadian engineers needed help building bridges and clearing obstacles under fire, Black American engineering battalions would volunteer immediately. The Canadian officers commanding these operations treated the black soldiers with the same respect they showed their own men, and the black soldiers responded with exceptional performance. Reports from multiple commanders noted that integrated Canadian and Black American work parties consistently outperformed segregated American units. The difference was simple. Men who felt respected worked harder. Men who felt degraded did the minimum. The evidence was there for anyone willing to see it. Segregation was not just morally wrong, it was militarily inefficient. It wasted human potential and undermined unit cohesion. The Canadian experience proved this conclusively. But seeing evidence and accepting it are different things, and the U.S. Army's leadership was not yet ready to accept what the evidence showed. They continued enforcing segregation throughout the war, ignoring the clear proof that integration worked better. For the Canadian soldiers who had stood up that night in Portsmouth and in dozens of similar incidents afterward, the experience shaped how they understood themselves and their country. They had made a choice to defend their values even when it was inconvenient, even when it risked diplomatic friction with their most important ally. That choice became part of the Canadian identity, part of how Canadians distinguished themselves from Americans. They were the nation that stood up for equality. They were the soldiers who protected the vulnerable. This narrative was not entirely accurate, of course. Canada had its own terrible history of racial injustice, particularly toward Indigenous peoples. But the narrative took hold nonetheless, becoming part of the national myth. When the war ended and soldiers returned home, many of them carried these experiences with them. William Davies went back to Toronto and became a union organizer, fighting for workers' rights with the same stubborn determination he had shown standing up in that recreation hall. Thomas Baudouin returned to Montreal and became active in civil rights causes, always remembering the night he had stood between American MPs and soldiers who needed protection. Lieutenant James Morrison became a teacher in Ottawa, and he made sure his students learned about the reality of segregation and the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it costs you something. Jerome Washington survived the war and went back to Chicago. He tried to settle into civilian life, but he found it impossible to accept the segregation and discrimination that had seemed normal before the war. He had seen something different in England. He knew there was another way. He became active in the NAACP and participated in early civil rights organizing. When people asked him why he was willing to risk so much, he would tell them about the Canadians. He would describe standing in that recreation hall, expecting to be dragged out by MPs, and instead seeing Canadian soldiers rise to defend him. He would talk about being treated like a human being for the first time in his life, and he would say that once you have experienced dignity, you cannot accept degradation anymore. The Canadians had shown him what was possible, and he was going to fight until America matched that possibility. Thousands of other black veterans had similar transformations. The war had taken them overseas and shown them that the American way was not the only way. They had met people who treated them as equals. They had fought and bled for a country that refused to recognize their humanity, while foreign soldiers treated them like brothers. When they came home to the same old discrimination, many of them decided they were done accepting it. They became the backbone of the civil rights movement, men who had faced German bullets and were not about to back down from Southern sheriffs. The story of Canadian soldiers protecting black GIs never became widely known outside military circles in specific communities. It was not the kind of thing that official history celebrated. It complicated the narrative of Allied unity and exposed uncomfortable truths about American racism. In Canada, the story was occasionally mentioned with quiet pride, but never heavily promoted, perhaps because Canadians recognized their own racial hypocrisies made them poor teachers on the subject. In the United States, the story was buried, an embarrassing reminder of how America treated its black soldiers. But the people who were there remembered. Veterans groups would gather decades later, and old men would tell younger generations about the night the Canadians stood up, about recreation halls where everyone was welcome, about military police who protected instead of harassed. These oral histories kept the story alive in families and communities, passed down like treasured heirlooms. Some Black American veterans chose to immigrate to Canada after the war, drawn by memories of being treated with dignity. They settled in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, bringing with them stories about Canadian soldiers who had been willing to risk consequences to do what was right. The legacy of those moments extends beyond individual stories. The Canadian military took lessons from the war years and built them into institutional practice. Integration became a core value, not just accepted, but celebrated. When Canada built its post-war military, it emphasized equality and mutual respect across all ranks and backgrounds. This was partly idealistic and partly practical. Canadian commanders had seen firsthand that integrated units performed better, and they wanted to maintain that advantage. The contrast with American practice remained stark for years. While the U.S. military struggled with integration even after President Truman's 1948 order, Canadian forces had already normalized it. When Canadian and American troops served together in Korea in the early 1950s, the differences were obvious. Canadian units were integrated and functioned smoothly. American units were still grappling with the transition, with resistance from officers and enlisted men who had grown up in a segregated military. Canadian observers noted that their American counterparts seemed to spend as much energy managing racial tensions as fighting the enemy. The philosophical truth at the heart of this story is about moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. The Canadian soldiers who stood up that night in Portsmouth were not extraordinary people. They were ordinary men faced with a choice. They could follow the path of least resistance, looking away while injustice happened in front of them, or they could take a stand knowing it would create problems. They chose to stand. That choice required courage, but it was not superhuman courage. It was the everyday courage of deciding that your principles matter more than your comfort. This kind of courage is available to anyone. It does not require special training or unique circumstances. It requires only a willingness to act when action is needed. The Canadian soldiers saw something wrong happening, and they stepped forward. They did not overthink it or calculate consequences. They saw fellow soldiers being mistreated and decided it was unacceptable. That clarity of moral vision, that willingness to trust your instincts about right and wrong, is something anyone can cultivate. The story also illustrates the power of small actions in the face of large systems. The Canadian soldiers could not change American segregation policies. They could not transform the U.S. military or overturn Jim Crow laws. But they could control what happened in their own spaces. They could make their recreation halls and facilities welcoming to everyone. They could refuse to cooperate with enforcement of unjust rules. These small actions created ripples that spread outward in ways they never anticipated, affecting thousands of soldiers and planting seeds that would grow into larger movements. This is the lesson that transcends the specific historical moment. You do not need power over everything to make a difference. You need only to exercise whatever power you do have in service of what is right. The Canadian soldiers had authority over their own facilities. They used that authority to create spaces of equality and dignity. That was enough to matter enormously to the people who experienced it. The bonds formed between Canadian and Black American soldiers in those English recreation halls proved that respect and equality are not just moral imperatives, but practical advantages. Units that trained together and trusted each other performed better in combat. Soldiers who felt valued gave more of themselves. The segregationists always argued that integration would undermine discipline and military effectiveness, but the Canadian experience proved exactly the opposite. Integration enhanced effectiveness by unlocking the full potential of all soldiers and building trust that paid dividends under pressure. As decades passed and the immediacy of the war faded, the story took on new meanings for new generations. In the 1960s and 70s, as both Canada and the United States grappled with civil rights movements and questions of national identity, the tale of Canadian soldiers protecting Black GIs became a parable about the kind of country Canada aspired to be. It was a story Canadians could tell themselves about their values and their willingness to stand up for those values even when it cost them something. For Black communities in both countries, the story remained powerful for different reasons. It was proof that the degradation they experienced was not inevitable or natural. It showed that white people could choose to treat Black people with dignity and respect, that racism was a choice rather than an unchangeable reality. This knowledge was both empowering and infuriating. Empowering because it showed what was possible, infuriating because it made clear that white Americans had chosen racism when they could have chosen something better. The story continues to resonate today because the fundamental questions it raises remain unresolved. How do we respond when we see injustice? What do we owe to strangers who are being mistreated? When do we have an obligation to step forward even when stepping forward is uncomfortable or dangerous? These are not questions that get answered once and then settled. They arise in every generation, in every community, in countless situations where people must decide whether to act or look away. The Canadian soldiers in Portsmouth chose to act. They stood up when it would have been easier to sit down. They spoke up when it would have been safer to stay silent. They used whatever power they had to create a small space of justice in an unjust world. That choice, repeated across dozens of facilities and hundreds of nights, made a real difference in the lives of thousands of soldiers. It proved that ordinary people acting with moral courage can create change even in the face of powerful institutions and entrenched systems. This is why the story matters. Not because it solved everything or ended segregation or transformed America. It matters because it shows us what is possible when people decide that dignity matters more than convenience, that justice matters more than comfort, that doing right matters more than avoiding conflict. The Canadian soldiers who protected Black GIs in England during World War II were not heroes in the traditional sense. They did not win medals or lead charges or capture strategic positions. But they did something harder and more important. They chose to be decent human beings when decency required courage. They chose to stand with the vulnerable when standing with them created problems. They chose to live their values instead of just talking about them. That choice echoes across 80 years, reminding us that we face similar choices every day. We may not be in recreation halls in wartime England, but we encounter moments where we must decide whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to act or look away, whether to stand with those being mistreated or protect our own comfort. The story of Canadian soldiers protecting Black GIs teaches us that these choices define us, that how we respond in these moments reveals who we truly are. And it teaches us that choosing right over easy is always possible, always available, always within our power. We need only the courage to make that choice, the clarity to recognize when the moment arrives, and the conviction to follow through regardless of cost. That is the legacy those soldiers left us. That is the story we must remember and carry forward.